Written by Mr. Michael Squid. In my 15 years on Mulberry Lane, I rarely met my neighbors. A friendly wave when raking leaves or taking out the trash sufficed. I've always been a bit awkward, and I think of my home as the one place I can breathe and drop the social facade. I saw the moving van a few weeks ago, outside of the eggshell blue house next door, and presumed a family was moving in. I didn't notice anyone but the movers during brief glances out of my curtains. I minded my own for a few days, but then I began hearing the cries. Every night once the sun went down, the muffled wailing of an infant would sound from the house next door. It wasn't too intrusive, and the sturdy walls of our craftsman homes offered plentiful noise reduction. A family fleeing the city to raise a child in the suburbs seemed only natural, of course. But the crying wouldn't subside, and it sounded, for lack of a better word, off. The high-pitched wail was just a bit too gravelly. The timing of the howls a tad too consistent. One Thursday, as the street became enshrouded in shadow and that cry began, I headed to the east side of my home and lifted open the heavy window facing the blue house of the neighbors to better hear. Perhaps it was the cool gust of autumn air on my skin that triggered a fear response, or the large shadows from the moonlight feeding my imagination. I listened to that wailing sound, a few decibels higher with my window's pane lifted, and it sounded almost animal. Something distinctly different than the cries of a human baby. I locked that second-story window after closing it that night. My curiosity grew as certain peculiarities I could not explain became more frequent. A few days later, I returned from a grocery run. As I pulled into my driveway, I sat in my car for a few minutes, observing the pale blue house of the unseen neighbors. It looked very different, yet the same. It took a while to work out what seemed to be different. The house appeared to be closer, just by a foot or two. Something clearly impossible in every regard, of course, but impossible to ignore nonetheless. The 30-foot space between our homes looked just shy of that. The dull-painted wood siding, flaking with neglect, was more prominent and in focus. I proceeded to unlock my door, then doubled back to bring my produce inside. On the east side of my home, from out my kitchen window, their house did appear to be closer. Their dark window panes looked larger, closer than they previously had been. I consider myself a rational man, so I did my best to ignore the phenomenon. I did a good job of getting lost in my work, until the golden sun began to set, a veil of shadow extinguishing its glow. I did my best to avoid looking out my windows. Getting worked up over nothing is counterproductive, even unhealthy. Still, once it was fully night, that strange cry sounded from next door. Louder. It was so very clearly louder. I exited my study and followed the hallway to the window overlooking the neighboring home. Framed within my window pane was that of the neighbors. It was undoubtedly closer. I approached without thinking, walking slowly down the runner carpet. I reached my window and looked through theirs. It was dark, the only sign of life, that harsh crying that lit up the corner of my mind reserved for superstition and make-believe. My fingers pressed against the cold glass as I looked into the dark second-story floor of my neighbors. In the void of light, shrouding their interior in darkness, I saw some fast movement, an appendage whipping in the dark from one side of the window to the other. Something impossible to identify. Maybe an arm? Maybe? Fear got the better of me. I briskly walked through my home, locking the windows and doors. Out of sight, out of mind, I mused, wiping my hands as if the gesture would rid myself of that tingling feeling of horror at my runaway imagination. I chuckled to myself, finally accepting how preposterous I was being. With a deep exhale, I poured a glass of red wine and plopped down onto the couch to watch something. A comedy. Despite all my efforts, I was unable to ignore the fact that I had to raise the volume a few bars in order to hush the crying from the neighboring house. That week, work came in an avalanche. I freelanced, so I was grateful not only for the money that would come, but for the fact that I would actually be busy again. Idle hands, as the saying goes. Long days stretched into the evenings as I toiled away debugging sloppy code. In the white light of the screen, I kept my earbuds in to drown out the terrible cries from next door. It's none of my business, I muttered to myself when pushing the earbuds deeper and raising the volume. I opened a browser window and ordered a set of curtains. That seemed enough to calm my nerves, and I was eventually able to fall asleep that night. Try as I might to convince myself it was all some optical illusion or lapse in memory, I was unable to. That was punctuated after fetching the mail a week ago. I exited my front door and felt every neck hair raise when I felt the proximity of the house next door. When I turned my head, I just stood there, stunned. It was roughly 15 feet from my home, undeniably closer than it previously had been. Just to allay my worries, to ease these unnatural fears lurking about in my mind, I decided to meet the neighbors. Just a friendly introduction and maybe mentioning the peculiar phenomenon. They might think I was crazy, but at least I'd have a face of the mother or father to put my mind at rest. Maybe a glimpse of the baby creating those hideous sounds all hours of the night. After a deep breath, I walked along the concrete path to the sidewalk. It was only when I'd nearly reached their pathway that I realized something I hadn't before. There was no car in the driveway, nor had there ever been. I swallowed the lump that grew in my throat and tried to calm myself. It was a sunny day, lovely in all regards aside from the large blue home that loomed overhead, casting a stark shadow. I knocked and waited. Nobody answered the door, but someone was clearly home. I heard a muffled scampering sound from behind the door. Despite the sounds from inside, nobody answered. "Hello? I'm Mitchell, the neighbor. Just wanted to apologize for not greeting you earlier." I tried to maintain a chipper, neighborly voice, but it came out shaky. The sounds of movement from within the house left my insides cold. Something was quickly darting about and then stopping, as if listening. I flinched when I heard a heavy thud from somewhere deeper within. Curiosity led me closer to the tall, narrow windows on the sides of the door. I just wanted any sort of visual confirmation of my neighbors, just some sign that things were normal. I leaned in closer to the dark glass, peering in. Every light was off, and the sunlight that gave sight to the interior was strangely dim. I could barely make out anything at all, just the general shape of a staircase like mine, a pink wallpaper that looked to have a glossy sheen. It looked wrong, somehow. but I couldn't place it at the time. In retrospect, I think it was that the walls and stairs had an irregular texture. I quickly recoiled from the window, running back along the grass towards my home. I tried the police, but was lost for what I could even say. I settled on a wellness check, mentioning the sounds of a neglected infant from within and no vehicle or sign of neighbors. I left out the most peculiar detail, the fact the house seemed to be getting closer to mine every day. I watched from my window when the police cruiser arrived as the sun dipped beneath the mesh of tree branches. I saw the officer step outside his car and walk the path to their front door. He knocked, waited, and looked in the window. He circled the house and vanished from view, presumably to look in other windows. I watched for a while, for any sign of him reappearing, but he did not. Eventually, I was so creeped out I had to stop looking at that house. I preoccupied myself with the internet as the sun sank and evening came. And then I heard the gritty crying that's not quite human. I walked downstairs to refill my water glass, and when I peeked out my kitchen window, I let out a gasp of shock. The neighbor's window was right there, just feet away from mine. I could even see into the shadowy home. The fuzzy darkness supplied a little insight into what was within, and that crippling fear lurching up from the crevices of my mind returned. I could see the walls, slick, wet, and lumpy. An organic, hollow form with fleshy walls that jittered and twitched ever so slightly. It was like looking into the beaded fat and veiny muscle of a freshly gutted elk. Bone-like support beams were visible through the translucent membrane I'd previously mistaken as wallpaper. I screamed, and it screamed back. The infant cries, coarse and distorted, bellowed from deep within the impossible structure. I panicked then, gathering a few belongings, phone charger, wallet, jacket, cash, and descended the staircase. I'd rent a hotel and call the police, recommending backup. I played through the actions in my head, thinking of the cheap motel off the highway just 15 minutes away. My skin crawled as I reached the first door and tried to ignore the undeniable sight out my kitchen window. I looked directly into that fluid, glazed, organic interior of the neighboring home. I focused on the front door, trying as hard as I could not to register the fact that the horrible house next door now appeared to be directly attached to my home. I was jogging by the time I reached my front door, undoing the deadbolt with nervous digits. My mind was screaming at me to move faster, get to the car, but then I opened the door. A dark, red interior lay beyond my door. A continuation into a cubic body cavity with viscera and veins. There was a stink of coppery meat, the smell of a butcher's shop in the dead of summer, humid and rank. I slammed the door closed to the impossible horror that had somehow encompassed my home. My feet sprinted, carrying me to the basement door, which I locked behind me in a frenzy. Here I wait, in the dark basement as the screaming and gurgling sounds draw closer overhead. Wooden beams creak and groan. Glass occasionally shatters. I dialed emergency services again, but the signal is blocked by whatever has encased my home. A matchbook I found on the shelf rests in one hand, a tin of gasoline in the other. A last resort, quickly becoming my only option. I made my peace and accepted my fate. I only have one request for anyone out there who might see a house ablaze on Mulberry Lane. Make sure they don't put the fire out. I'm begging you. Let it burn. thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?